Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Ackerman, Executive Director of Columbus Citizens Foundation, and I'm really thrilled to have Norma Barbacci with us this evening. Norma's a preservation architect with a long and distinguished career, but I'm also very happy to call her a past colleague. We overlapped for more than a decade at World Monuments Fund together and knew each other even before that. So she's been a trusted colleague for a long time, and I learned a lot from Norma over the years. And I'm hoping you're really going to enjoy her story this evening that takes you from Italy to Peru to maybe she's going to tell us about her time in Pittsburgh, and then to a pivotal moment in her career in Civita di Bagnoregio, which we are both showing in our virtual backgrounds. Norma's actually had the distinction of really working around the world. So she could tell us about dozens of places that we've never been to, but will want to go to after she tells us about them. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Norma, to tell us your journey this evening.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen in a second. Let's see, presenter's view. Let me see if you can you see it correctly? You should be seeing just my first slide.
Yes, perfect.
Got it. Okay. So as Lisa said, in this presentation, I'm going to try to do, a short, present a trajectory of my life, career, and how it actually, Italy is actually interwoven in this whole, arc of my trajectory. So I'm going to start with the Barbaccis in Italy. The Barbaccis, as with those Italians whose last name ends in Acci, which is something I learned not too long ago. They come from Toscana, from Tuscany. So my family came from, supposedly from this small town called Montevettolini, which is a small hill town located in the region of Pistoia in Tuscany. It's about 20 miles from Florence. And I found out it's also about 7 miles from Vinci, which is the birthplace of Leonardo. And I love that sort of closeness or association. Anyway, in Montevettolini, there was a 16th century Medici villa, and Montevettolini was also called Montevetturino. And a few years ago, my sister in the picture at the top right and her daughter visited this town, and she found a Barbacci gate and she took a picture of it. And to my dismay, I noticed that it's got scaffolding, metal scaffolding, which in the case is not in great structural conditions. So I think I'm going to have to go there to check out what condition this Barbacci gate, it is. And also, it is possible. I think it's possible that my love for Italian hill towns, as you will see shortly, may come from these early sort of family roots. So in the early 20th century, my grandfather, Carlo Barbacci, left Italy and went to Argentina, where he became a second tenor in the choir of the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires. He married my grandmother, Giuseppina Catocchio, also an immigrant from Italy, and they had 2 children. And I believe it was my grandparents who started the tradition of naming their children after opera characters. And so they named my father Rodolfo from La Bohème, and his sister Tosca after Puccini's opera. And they also became musicians. In 1938, at the age of 28, my father left Buenos Aires to join the Peruvian National Symphony in Lima. And he joined as a cello player, although he played other instruments as well. And 2 years later, he married my mother, Elena Flores, who was Peruvian, and who was one of his piano students. So they had 5 children, of which I am the youngest. And the opera naming tradition was continued by my father, and I was named Norma after Bellini's opera. However, I've been thinking that I would have preferred to be named after a fallen woman like Violeta in La Traviata, or a seamstress like Mimi in La Bohème, rather than a potential child killer like Norma, but oh well. So I grew up in Peru, and I lived in Lima until I was 17. And I came to the US to go to school, to go to university. At that point, I had a brother and two sisters living in the States. So for me, you know, this transition was kind of relatively painless and easy. Although my first year was kind of difficult because I had to learn English, which was obviously not my first language. So I did end up in Pittsburgh, like Lisa mentioned, and where my brother and one of my sisters live. And after a few months of studying English, I finally, applied to the architecture program at Carnegie Mellon University. But there were no architects in my immediate family. But I thought, well, if I like to draw and I like math, maybe I should, take on architecture. And so I did. I thought that would be a right career for me, but I really had no familiar or personal reference regarding architecture. But when I told my father that I wanted to be an architect, he said, "You will starve." And meanwhile, he wanted me to become a professional musician. So I don't know who was right at this point. But anyway, in 1982, during the summer before my senior year in architecture school at Carnegie Mellon, I joined a study abroad program in the town of Civita di Bagnoregio. This is a tiny hill town in northern Lazio, about 60 miles north of Rome. And the following is a quote from a New York Times article by Deborah Needleman from 2017, which I thought described Civita in a nutshell. The first thing that must be said about the ancient town of Civita di Bagnoregio, just 2 hours away from Rome and Florence, is that it is beautiful. From a distance, it looks literally otherworldly. The town sits so high atop a perilously steep pinnacle of eroding volcanic rock that it seems that if it's perched upon clouds rather than tethered to the earth. Its very sediment is strapped with 2,500 years of architectural history. Etruscan caves, ancient remains, medieval dwellings, and Renaissance villas. Originally a center along ancient trade routes, Civita di Bagnoregio was prosperous from Roman times through the late Middle Ages. But after a devastating earthquake in 1695, most residents fled for lower ground, and so began the city's long decline. By the end of World War II, nearly all of its inhabitants had left in search of work in cities or abroad. And for the last half century, its population has hovered around 10 or so full-time residents. Because the erosion of the hill is so severe, houses have been tumbling off its sides since the 1700s. Civita di Bagnoregio will eventually be reclaimed by the landscape. Residents and visitors alike must park at the base and ascend a steep, very steep footbridge to enter through a huge Gothic archway. Past the backless facade of a Renaissance house with several of its windows open to the sky like a stage set, lies a small, dusty piazza with a church, a fine 7th century medieval tower, a small bar, and not much else. There is no pharmacy or school, no hospital, none of the necessities that somehow serve to make a place a place. There are only a couple of inns and a few restaurants. Civita is real without being actual, if that makes any sense. So the program I went to in 1982 in Chibita was organized by the University of Washington in Seattle, and it was led by the architect Astra Sarina. A group of students from Carnegie Mellon were invited to join their program, and during the course of the summer, we managed to make friends with the young people in Bagnoregio. We learned how to play briscola, a fantastic card game. We learned a bit of Italian and Italian culture. We cooked and ate well. We drank wine, of course. We visited many hill towns. We drew a lot and eventually developed an architecture project. This was the beginning of my lifelong affair with Civita in Italy, for which I must give full credit to Astra Sarina. Astra Sarina was an architect born in Riga, Latvia in 1929. Her and her family immigrated in 1949 to the Seattle area. She received a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and a master's from MIT. In 1960, she became the first woman to receive the Rome Prize in Architecture, followed by a Fulbright Fellowship also in Rome. And during her stay in Italy, she discovered Civita di Bagnoregio, and on one of her visits, she was caught in a fierce rainstorm and was invited to wait out the storm in a local home. As she admired this large fireplace in the middle of the picture, the family offered to sell her the one-room house. She bought it on the spot, she was no dummy, and spent the next 2 years restoring her room, as well as undertaking several other restoration projects in Chibita. In 1970, she established the University of Washington's Architecture in Rome study abroad program. And the following year, she married American architect Anthony Costa Haywood, known as Tony, in Rome. In 1976, she started a second University of Washington architecture program, this time focused on Italian hill towns. And this program was based in Civita di Bagnoregio, where she by now had purchased a few other ruins and restored them. Astra influenced generations of architects, including famous ones like Stephen Hall, who credits her for his awakening regarding architectural design. And for me, the experience of living and studying in Chibita that summer in the early 80s changed not only my views of architecture and preservation, but also had a profound effect in my personal life. So I returned to Carnegie Mellon after that summer to complete my architecture training. And during my senior year, I worked on an adaptive reuse project that focused on a historic library. It was a historic Carnegie library in the town of Braddock, Pennsylvania. Braddock was a depressed community affected by the closing of the steel mills in the area. And that experience, together with the previous summer in Chibita, kind of set me on a career path that was going to include Italy and preservation for decades to come. After graduation, I was still bent on going back to Italy, somehow. I applied to the University of Florence Master in Preservation program. So in preparation, I went to the Université per Stranieri di Perugia to improve, actually, to really learn Italian. But I had, at some point, a change of heart and decided to instead come back to the US and look for graduate programs here. However, Italy was already in my blood and heart, and I would be drawn back there at every opportunity I got. So in 1985, I applied to the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia University, which is a 2-year program that required an internship in the field of preservation in order to graduate. So at the end of my first year, I contacted Astra Sarina in Chibita and asked her if there was something I could do there. She responded with a suggestion of doing a documentation project for her. So during the summer of 1986, Glenn Bornasian, my boyfriend at the time, and I measured and drew a group of ruins that Astra and Tony were looking to convert into their main living quarters. So we used a measuring device called the perigraph. And the perigraph, it was this French machine that we actually borrowed from Columbia University. And we used it to obtain exact dimensions that we then we were able to use to produce measured drawings for Astra's purposes. But also I used the resulting drawings and the research I did at Astra's library to develop my graduating thesis at Columbia University. While in Chibita, Glenn and I got engaged and married the following year in 1987. And since then, we have been going back every few years, including for our 10th and our 25th wedding anniversaries, which happened to fall during Ferragosto. So after graduating from Columbia, I worked for a couple of years for Charles Platt, who was a former professor, and trying to get some experience in preservation projects as project architect. And then later on, I joined Beyer Blinder Bell Architects, which is a New York architectural preservation and planning firm known for their work at Ellis Island, Grand Central Station, and a couple of other, major projects. And I was there for 12 years, working as a project manager on many preservation projects, including an early 20th century cathedral in Utah, in Salt Lake City, a library in Baltimore, a theater on 42nd Street, the South Street Seaport, the New York Historical Society, among others. While at BBB, I was asked by WMF to help as a consultant in the convent of Guadalupe in Extremadura, Spain. It was at the inauguration of this project in 1992 when I met Lisa Ackerman, and she could say something about that experience later on. And in 2001, after a few years, I continued at Bayer Blinderbelt, but in 2001, I was hired full-time by World Monuments Fund. And during the following 16 years, I was a program director for Latin America, Spain, and Portugal. And I managed a portfolio of about, over 100 projects, which included envisioning and implementing comprehensive conservation and training programs, monuments and sites, all the way from Mexico to Easter Island in Chile, as well as some important projects in Spain, like the Alhambra and the Segovia Aqueduct. And some of the projects, I'm just gonna show you a few of my projects in Latin America. The first one, Lisa would think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this, because I drove her crazy about this for years, is the Jesuit Guarani missions, which consist of the remains of 30 towns that prospered under the direction of the Jesuits in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were built in the heart of a tropical forest near the Paraná and Uruguay rivers in a region known as Paraguaria, which is now present-day Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. The missions of this kind were kept the Guarani language intact and offered the nomad Guarani protection from war and slave drivers. And if you want to learn more about these missions, you must see the film The Mission with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, and that will give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So the mission of San Ignacio Mini, Argentina, is one of these missions. Became part of the World Monuments Watch list in 1996. And WMF supported several conservation field projects there, including a multi-year capacity building program designed to train the local site managers in conservation, in documentation, management, and tourism development, including, and we also organized a yearly workshop and a practical conservation course at each of the participating countries. The final project was completed in 2007, and it included the publication of a conservation manual that served for many years. I don't know if they're still using it, but for many years was used as a guide for conservation campaigns in the Jesuit missions. The other project I'd like to tell you about are the Fortifications of Panama. The San Jerónimo and San Lorenzo forts are important Spanish colonial fortifications that were built between 1596 and 1779. They were built to facilitate the transport of gold and other resources from Central and South America to Spain via Caribbean ports. They were critical to the defense of Spain's trade routes throughout the New World, which were regularly attacked by pirates and rival colonial powers. We implemented several projects, including a study that explored the comprehensive conservation of sites that had endangered cultural as well as natural resources. We did some priority conservation projects in San Lorenzo and several conservation projects in the town of Portobello, including the partial conservation of the San Jerónimo Fort, and elaboration conservation plans, etc., and then development of a proposal for improving the urban image of central Portobello. In between 2008 and 2011, we implemented a comprehensive conservation plan for the Church of San Pedro de Andalias. That included the restoration of the choir, the main facade, chapels, etc., all of the interiors and all of the exterior, including mural paintings on canvas, and also the religious art, the sacred art. The project also included the cataloging of their artistic objects, the installation of an alarm system, which we considered it was really essential, and the implementation of a public information program titled Open for Restoration, or in Spanish, Abierto por Obras. The WMF project team, the parish, and the National Institute of Culture, we also collaborated on the landmark designation of the historic town of Andalias, which until 2010 was not protected, even though it was a pretty valuable historic resource. In 2009, we launched a 3-year youth heritage program, which was aimed at promoting interest among the local youth, encouraging them to explore the works of their ancestors and providing them with the skills and opportunities that would enable them to become actively involved in the protection, interpretation, and promotion of their own cultural heritage. After the completion of their training, in 2012, this group of youngsters formed a non-for-profit organization called Grupo Patrimonio Coriorco, and they continue working on the documentation of local traditions. They were working on an interactive map of Andalias. They organized a Heritage Day to celebrate the date when the town was included as recognized as a landmark, and the organization of workshops and different projects that actually engage the community, but also, or in particular, children and high school children in the entire province. The other site I wanted to tell you about the project is the archaeological site of Changkiyo. And Changkiyo is located in the north coast of Peru, a few hours north of Lima, and it may be the earliest known astronomical observatory in the Americas. It was built over 2,300 years ago, and the site features a plaza, 13 towers that align on top of a natural ridge, and a fortified temple. It was on the 2010 World Monuments Watch list, in order to raise awareness of the threats that were, that the site was facing, which included centuries of exposure to winds, humidity, temperature fluctuations, as well as earthquakes and other major weather events, such as El Niño, that caused erosion and weakening of the stone elements in the site. So at WMF, we supported a comprehensive restoration and development project, including the restoration of its 13 towers, the development of a management plan, which was later used to support a UNESCO World Heritage Site application in 2021. So in 2021, in July 2021, the Changkiyo Archaeoastronomical Complex was finally inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Another, of course, I would be remiss if somehow didn't find a way of bringing Civita di Bagnoregio into World Monuments Fund. So using Civita di Bagnoregio, Pitiliano, and Orvieto as case studies for the exploration of solutions to the problems faced by the tough towns, the World Monuments Fund convened an international symposium in Chibita in May 2008. So the meeting had over about 70 participants from Italy, the US, and included visits to these 3 towns. The idea was to observe and learn about the different structural stabilization projects that were being applied at each of the sites. People discussed short and long-term plans for the protection of the villages, and others like it. And several collaborations resulted between the heritage professionals that joined the meeting. In the spring of 2013, the authorities in Chibita began to charge money to actually go over the bridge. And for each entering tourist, they would charge €3. So this money was used for the upkeep of the site, and later on paid for partially for the reinforcement works that were carried out on the north and south slopes of the hill, as well as to repairs to the access bridge. And after a devastating landslide in 2015 that caused a temporary closure of the bridge, the governor of Lazio, decided to call for Chibita's inclusion as a UNESCO World Heritage list. So they started working on that nomination since then. But returning to the 2008 meeting in Chibita, it was amazing. It was great to see Astra, and she was totally thrilled about having more Monuments Fund pay attention to Chibita and having this international meeting there. And although she wasn't well enough to leave her house and join all the activities, a lot of the participants actually came to visit her and pay their respects. And so she really, in a way, got to enjoy the meeting. But 3 months later, in August 2008, she died at the age of 79. But just to finish the chapter of Astra and Chibita, I would like to mention that in 1981, Astra and Tony and a group of Seattle academics and architects decided to co-found the Chibita Institute, which is a nonprofit organization created to promote design excellence through education and cultural exchange. The Institute facilities occupy all of those properties that Astra and Tony restored in Civita di Bagnoregio, and they were donated by them to this institute. In 2015, myself, as well as a couple of Astra students based on the East Coast, mainly New York and Boston, we established the Civita Institute Northeast chapter with the goal of expanding the geographical reach of Civita Institute, which is literally, more like Seattle or West Coast based. And this chapter, through this chapter, we coordinated and funded 1- and 2-month fellowships for architects, artists, landscape architects, preservationists, planners, art historians, even writers and other art professionals that were wishing to pursue independent research or projects in Civita di Bagnoregio. And between 2015 and 2019, we sponsored 10 fellows and organized several public presentations and social gatherings with, obviously, lots of Italian food and wine in the spirit of Astra and Tony's gatherings. And we hope to resume our public presentations and gatherings as soon as the pandemic is a little bit more under control. And then, so after leaving War Monuments Fund in 2017, I established Norma Barbacci Preservation Consultants, and basically one-person show. And I specialize in preservation of international cultural heritage. And during that period of, since 2017 and until the present, I have worked for several clients, including War Monuments Fund. So for WMF, I helped identify some possible historic preservation projects in Cuba. And I'm still currently helping them with the coordination of the rehabilitation of the Santa Clara Convent in Havana, in collaboration with the Office of the Historian of Havana. Another client is the Inter-American Development Bank, and with them I've done a project in Panama. So I consulted with IDB and the National Institute of Culture in Panama on the conservation and management of the fortifications of Portobello and San Lorenzo, which I mentioned before. They were a War Monuments Fund site. I also did a project for the IDB in Suriname. It was about looking for opportunities for the preservation of the historic center of Paramaribo. And in Peru, I collaborated with Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance, known as CHIFA, which is a non-for-profit organization created by Bonnie Burnham, the former president of WMF. And we worked on the development of a framework for evaluating blended finance opportunities within urban heritage regeneration projects. And we developed a methodology for private sector engagement using the city of Trujillo in Peru as a pilot site. So all of this, and then another client, which is Italian, Ars Progetti, which is an international company based in Rome. With them, I was a team leader in a technical assistant project financed by the European Union in Peru, and it was called Public-Private Alliance on Cultural Heritage. And this project resulted in the development of 2 cultural routes in Lima. We also organized 5 workshops and seminars, focused on private participation in the management of cultural heritage. This all happened in 2021. And 2 years before, I also for the EU and through Ars Progetti, I organized a public symposium on public-private management of cultural heritage, and helped the Peruvian delegation of the EU identify and select heritage sites to be rehabilitated on the occasion of the bicentennial of the independence of Peru. So these projects were supposed to be all finished last year, but they haven't been. Anyway, I also involved in a couple of non-for-profit organizations. One is the Chibita Institute, which I previously mentioned, and the other one is Friends of Havana, which is a project that was established created in 2015 by a group of urban planners and filmmakers to assist Cuban urban planners and architects to plan the future of Havana. Friends of Havana and the War Monuments Fund were responsible for the organization of an international workshop in Havana in February 2017, which was titled Hablemos de La Habana, no? Let's talk about Havana. And when Friends of Havana was established in 2019 as a non-for-profit, I joined their board, and now we are currently implementing several projects in Havana with funding from the Ford Foundation. In 2020, I did a little exploration in the academic world when I was invited to serve as the Robert A.M. Stern Visiting Professor of Architecture at Yale University. And in collaboration with Professor Sunil Bal, we organized I wasn't sure, but they told me it was the first preservation-related architecture advanced studio at Yale. And the student project was based on the Ladeira de Misericordia, which is a historic site in Salvador de Bahia in Brazil. Also, it was on the War Monuments watch list years before. Now I've been invited to come back and teach a preservation seminar in 2023, but we're still trying to figure out what the exact subject is going to be. And now to finish, I'm just going to show you share some of the images from my recent trip to Italy last November. In Rome, we stayed at the American Academy, and while roaming around Trastevere, I visited the 5th century church of Santa Cecilia, supposedly built on the site of her house, where a sculpture by Stefano Maderno, is the second from the left, shows the saint right after her death. Then I went to the early 17th century of San Francesco a Ripa, which is the third one from the left, and saw this amazing sculpture by Bernini of Ludovica Albertoni. And then I ended up visiting the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, and really, which is an amazing site, one of the oldest churches in Rome from the 3rd century AD, and where is Cosmatesque style flooring, I thought was like really perfect for social distancing, and they used it pretty well that way. I also visited the 1st century Roman Arch of Titus near the Roman Forum and the Colosseum, and the 16th century Palazzo Farnese, one of the most important Renaissance palaces in Rome, which has this amazing trompe-l'oeil mural in front. Not sure for how long it's going to be there, but it was pretty spectacular. And one of the highlights, every time I go to Rome, is the non-Catholic cemetery, also known as the Protestant Cemetery, which is an 18th century private cemetery in the area of Testaccio in Rome. It is near the 1st century BC Pyramid of Cestius. Although it was also known as the English cemetery, it was the burial place of non-Catholics, including Protestants, Jews, and Orthodox, and of other nationalities as well as suicides and actors who died in Rome. And this is where the English poets Shelley and Keats were buried in the 1820s. And other important burials include Antonio Gramsci, the Italian philosopher, leader of the Italian Communist Party, and Manfredo Tafuri, an Italian architectural historian. And the site is quite famous, not just because of the important tombs and sculptures, but also for their many cats. There is actually an association that protects the cats of the cemetery, Cimitero Non Cattolico. We also took a trip north to the hill town of Montepulciano in Tuscany. And there we visited the 16th century Renaissance church of San Biagio by Antonio da Sangallo the Elder. We saw the Duomo de Santa Maria Assunta in beautiful Christmas colors, and went to the wine cantina of the Ricci family, located below this. There's the 16th century Palazzo Ricci in Montepulciano. While tasting their excellent wines, we were told the story of the Ricci family, which I thought was quite interesting. In the 13th century, a citizen of Montepulciano who was very good at predicting the weather got into a bit of trouble with the church because they thought he was a wizard. So he explained that he based his predictions on the observation of hedgehogs, or ricci in Italian, looking at the sun. So I guess his explanation got the church off his back and got him the nickname of Riccio, which was passed on to his descendants along a coat of arms, which features a little hedgehog looking at the sun, which is also the logo of the Ricci family wines. We also went to Piensa, and there we admire the 15th century cathedral by Bernardo Rossellino, whose design was influenced by the Renaissance humanist Leon Battista Alberti. The church was restored in the 1930s, and while doing a little bit of research on the subject, I discovered that Alfredo Barbacci, I assume a distant relative, I'm going to claim him as a distant relative, was responsible for the restoration of the Cathedral of Piensa in the 1930s. And according to this article that was published in 1987, Barbacci did a good job in bringing it back to its original form, but did not fix the structural problem that had affected the church since its construction. So Alfredo Barbacci was an architect, an engineer, who worked in many preservation projects in Italy and was also a professor of restoration science and restoration of monuments at the University of Florence from 1948 to 1960. So when I decided to not go to the University of Florence in the early 80s, I kind of missed the opportunity of following in his footsteps. And of course, we took a quick tour in Umbria and visited Orvieto. So the 14th century Duomo that was based on a design by Arnolfo di Cambio, the architect of the Cathedral of Florence. So the 13th century Palazzo del Capitano del Popolo, and admire several of the sgraffito decorated houses in town before returning to Lazio for our last leg of our trip, which of course ended in Civita di Bagnoregio, where time seems to have stopped, although the slow but steady erosion of the tufa foundations of the town continue. Life goes on, the seasons come and go, scaffolding goes up or comes down, and the cats are always there to welcome us back. Thank you.
Oops, sorry. Screwed that up a second. Well, that was fantastic, Norma. I could talk to you for hours. I'm not even sure where to start so that we can, answer any questions the audience might have. But I think I want to circle back to Civita di Bagnoregio for a minute, or maybe sort of Civita and Pitigliano as well. But I never knew that your father named all of you after opera characters. That's something I learned tonight. And I'm glad you did not follow in Norma's footsteps, carved out another life. And I'm thrilled to learn about Alfredo Barbacci. He has to be a relative, no question.
I'm gonna, I think I'm gonna own that. Yeah.
Exactly. All of the projects you mentioned, I mean, we could talk about any of them for, an hour at least. But since, we share a love for Italy and we both were deeply immersed in various projects in Italy, the most interesting thing was when this issue of the hill towns in Italy first came to the fore, and there's subsequently been lots of articles about the depopulation of these towns and what's happened. And Chivita is actually a success story because the summer artist residence programs and other exhibition programs and the mayor having been proactive, there's now not necessarily an increase in population, but there's an increase in use of the town. So it doesn't have that feeling of being a dying city any longer.
Sure.
But one of the things that came to light when we first started working on this project was that the engineering of the building of these towns on top of this volcanic rock was really quite something. So in the town of Pitiliano, which, you know, if Chivita's population year round was about 10,
Right.
Pitiliano's was about 100. and it's a beautiful scenic town that people visit and people have vacation homes there. But, you know, the population itself has dwindled dramatically, but these houses were built in the Middle Ages so that there's the house that you see, and then there's a basement, and then often underneath it, there was a sub-basement where they stored food and wine and other necessities of life. But it turned out that one of the most interesting things was that these towns that appear to be, you know, dots on the map on the top of these hills, they had fascinating connections that were discovered, and some of them believed to go back to Etruscan times, but you could actually exit through the sub-basements of these houses and find yourself out in the forest eventually. And there are roads that still connect these towns. And so it was a fascinating discovery that these towns were much more connected than we had ever understood, and that there was a lot of traffic, you know, in antiquity and in the Middle Ages between the towns. It's also believed in some cases that, particularly in Pitiliano, where there'd been a large Jewish population, that during World War II, it was a way to get provisions in and out for the Jewish families that remained. It also was a way to guide Jews out of the towns to safety. So these towns that we visit today, because they're so picturesque, they have this whole other history that's kind of told through the architecture and the engineering. But the other thing that we discovered from an engineering point of view was that these towns are Swiss cheese. That in fact, like what holds them to the hill is kind of goodwill, because when they were trying to figure out how to pin them back to the hill, they discovered there was nothing to pin them to. That because of these basements and sub-basements, when you try from an engineering point of view to look at the towns, you know, there's no way to pin them back to the hill. So these were kind of engineering and architectural marvels. And since you're an architect and have spent time there, you know, I'm wondering, like, do people have fear now that when they're in these houses, or they just believe they're so solidly built that it's all going to be fine?
Well, I mean, I think Pitiliano Chivita looks a little bit more precarious, you know, when you look at it. And I always go and kind of watch, you know, when I look up and take some pictures, but just kind of watch where I'm going, because every once in a while you see this caduta masi, you know, there's like rocks falling down and so on. So Chivita is an active erosion area, you know. Pitiliano is a little bit more, but you know, what you said about the Swiss cheese is so interesting, because when we were looking at the three techniques that the engineers were implementing in order to sort of consolidate the base of these three towns, meaning Orvieto, Pitiliano, and Chivita. So in Orvieto, they opted for creating sort of like retaining walls. So it kind of like, you know, enclosing and holding back the foundations of the hill town. In Pitiliano, they tried, you know, what you were talking about is actually pinning, sending pins from the outside to consolidate the inside, but they run into all these cantinas and via cave and holes, and you know, it was like Swiss cheese. So it was very difficult to find areas of actual solid rock that they could tie into it. So that developed a whole engineering project, which was just basically doing like a sonar to find out exactly where they could go. And in Chibita, they did quite an interesting technique, which is they dug almost like what looked like elevator shafts in the middle of the town. So they have like 10 of them in different areas. Some you can see, some you cannot. But there's one that that you can see. They put glasses and an interpretation panel, so you can see. It looks like an elevator shaft of concrete, maybe like 2 meters wide. I mean, 2 meters by 2 meters, and from that concrete shaft, they shot the pins outwards. So it's like the opposite system as in Pitiliano. I mean, I couldn't tell you if it's working or not. I hadn't seen any houses fall down, but I mean, in the last few years, but I have seen literally houses fall down in the last 20 years. There's no question. But the fact that these are all closely monitored, and there's other ways that there other techniques they're using to monitor any kind of movement in Chibita, and especially now that it's a World Heritage Site. So, and they have money from the entrance to town. So I feel a little bit more confident that what they're going to do, whatever it takes, whatever is needed to preserve the town. And prevent it from continue falling down the hill.
Well, we don't want to end on a depressing note, so let's switch to family history a little bit. And there's a large Italian population in Argentina. And because of you, I learned that Peru was actually a quite cosmopolitan country and not really one culture, but many different people. Was there an Italian community in Lima?
There was not as big as in Argentina by any means, and I think my father knew everybody, all the Italians, they all kind of hung together. But to me, it was more amazing to go to Argentina and see my Italian family there. I mean, they all spoke Italian, they yell over each other, and it was like the stereotypical Italian family, which I had not seen that in Peru. I mean, the Spanish, we also are very loud and all of that, but I had never passionate. Yes, passionate. That's a good word. But I had never, heard so many people speak Italian, and my father never taught us Italian. So from an early age, I saw all these people, these relatives talking in Italian when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying. And that's, I think, when I decided at some point I am going to study Italian. I'm going to learn that language. But yeah, it was a pity that my father didn't speak to us in Italian, but his family, they all kept their language and their cuisine for sure, and so on, close associations and this and that, which was something, that we lost when my father moved to Peru, because then he was like, most of our family there was not Italian. He was the only Italian in Peru. So that was a very different experience. But in a way, it was kind of like growing up and listening to this beautiful but unscrutable language. I thought, okay, I am going to learn it. So going to the Università per Stranieri in Perugia was really great. I mean, I really, really enjoyed that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say, I tell people this all the time that, when I went abroad my junior year and lived in Italy and had to speak Italian and function in Italian, I did feel a kind of kinship when I got there. Like I felt I belonged, even though I had grown up here in the United States. And similarly, I mean, my grandparents wanted their children to be as American as possible. So, my mother and aunt did not speak Italian and were really kind of discouraged from it. So I, learned it later, but I mean, I feel that strong connection to Italian culture nonetheless. And so I imagine when you went to Civita from school to there, that there was some sense that you were connecting to something that you did love and continue to love.
Yeah, no, it was definitely, Italy has been, like a country besides my, home of Peru, where I always tend to go back to, and it just has, we have very, very strong, associations and emotional as well as professional interest. But yep, Italy is right up there.
Well, that's great. And I think, one other thing that I am going to say is that, you realize the very close connection between Italian and Spanish culture when you study architecture. And you also kind of understand the migration of Italians to Central and South America, because I remember the very first time I visited Havana, you instantly recognize the architecture. And so it was no surprise when I learned that many of the workers who were brought over to build the city of Havana by the Spanish crown were, in fact, even though they were under Spanish dominion, they were Italians from Southern Italy. And so, you also kind of find that this overlap of architectural traditions and motifs. Italy and Spain, I mean, we have modern borders today, but a lot of it was much more fluid. And a lot of the architecture in Latin America has a very strong Italian motif to it. So.
Right. So I hear also in Venezuela, there was a huge, Italian immigration to Venezuela. I knew there was a book about the Italian architects in Venezuela. And like you mentioned in Cuba as well, there were a couple of the Italian architects were the ones that designed the National Schools of Art in Havana, which is one of, a crown achievement of the revolution, this modernist architecture. And 2 of the 3 architects were Italian. That immigrated.
I was thinking that when you were speaking. So I think we just have to have you back. We'll just have more theme. We'll have to have you come and talk about the artist in resident program
in Latin America. Yes, and all this
and also the artist in resident program in Chibita. How Chibita serves as inspiration today for people. So I think we have a lot of topics. The one comment in the chat that I'm going to repeat is that there's a call for, should we have a group trip to Montepulciano and Chibita. I'm all for that. So
yes,
you've already told us you're considering your next anniversary celebration in Chibita. Maybe we'll all come.
Okay. That will be next Ferragosto.
That's right. We'll all wish you auguri in person. So
thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for doing this tonight, Norma. It was a great
you're welcome.
treat. And so we hope to get you back, maybe in person, should COVID ever recede enough for us to meet in person. But thanks again.
Thank you. That was fun for me. Anyway,
Bye-bye.